Tonight we're going to tie what's called a woolly worm. Stay tuned. So recently we tied up a jig that was very reminiscent of an old-timey trolling streamer that was tied on a larger size jig head that was fished primarily for pike and walleye and all those fish with teeth. Tonight we're going to look at another one of those jigs. We'll talk about a couple of the books that I mentioned in the last video, and I'll be able to show you a couple examples that I pulled out of my father's old tackle box. So these I know were tied sometime in the, it's probably in the late 70s, maybe early 80s. These were jigs that Dad tied for himself specifically, maybe for some other old timers, but for the most part they really weren't sold. So let's switch over, and I will get my forceps. And what we have here is a 5/8 Barumba, which is just primarily a walleye jig. Do It has a similar size head. Their walleye head would be a perfect example, but this could also be tied on a ball head or a flathead jig. The body, as you can see, is chenille with the palmered hackle that goes up the body, and there's 2 or 3 hackle tips in the tail. This jig, you could also use turkey feathers or marabou would be 2 good choices for a tail for this jig. So this other example is kind of the just same colors, just opposite. So the black chenille with an orange palmered body with the 2 or 3 hackle tips for the tail. And on both of these you can see, and this is, you know, this is a good indication that was specifically Dad tied it for himself just to throw in his own tackle box, because the tip of the palmered hackle, here's the orange one, here's the black one. So Dad wrapped the hackle on, tied it off, and then, you know, normally I would cut this away, and I think in our example we'll show that, you know, we're going to cut that away. We're going to tie this exactly the way these were tied. I can't think of any different variation that I would do with this other than just swapping out colors that you think would be perfect in your area. These heads with the black stripe, use any head that you have that would work well. Add eyes, add stripes, two-tone colors, anything that we're fishing with modern day would work just fine for tying this jig. So we'll switch over to our vise, and we will begin. I have the same Barumba head painted in the same style. This is 1/2. We'll begin by locking the thread about halfway up the shank of the hook, and I'm going to walk the thread back towards the point of the hook with open wraps. We don't have to be terribly neat with this, and stopping right at about the point of the hook. I'll first tie in tie in 3 tips, I guess. Try to get a couple tips that are fairly pretty. So these are just regular streamer hackles. The tips, let's see, tips are just rounded tips. They don't come to a terribly sharp point. And I can just line them up, couple back to back, so they're not exactly, they're not cupping in the same direction. And on our example, the tail extends the length of the hook shank past the bend of the hook. So just shy of that, actually. So we will do the same. Measure this, and on my vise I have markings on the top. I'm going to shoot just past this 4th marking. I'm just going to trim these. You can save the butts. They would be perfect for palmering. I know that I can tell by these tips here that this wasn't a scrap piece. That's the tip of a good feather. So I walk the thread, locking it on, I walk the thread past the point of the hook, and then we're going to walk it, touching wraps all the way up to the head. And at this point you can take your head cement and just put a light drop right down the top of this hook shank. And then we'll walk the thread back to that hook point. And this little bit of the butts of the feather, that's okay. We can allow that to stick out. Before we add our chenille, I'm going to take a feather, and on our examples again, the tips of the palmered hackle are about 1.5 hook gaps. So the distance from the hook shank to the point of the hook, about 1.5 is the length. That looks good. So I'm going to just strip the fibers of this feather just so I can cut off the butt end. So I have a piece like so. I can lock this on with a few wraps towards the bend of the hook. And then I will take my chenille. This is just a regular Danville chenille. What if you went out to buy this today, you're looking for a size medium. And I just snip a piece that's long enough to work with. I could probably do 2 jigs with this, maybe 3. And I strip the fibers from that thread core. And on the other side of the hook shank, put a few wraps towards the bend of the hook. I can lock that on, and then I will walk the thread all the way up to the head of the jig. Now I'm going to wrap this away from me, and I'm first going to angle the first wrap towards the bend of the hook, and then when I come around, angle the chenille so it walks right up to the head. And all these wraps are between the jaws of my vise and the thread from the bobbin. And as I come around on this last wrap, I'm going to come around and bring the chenille to the outside of my bobbin. So when I switch hands, I pick up my bobbin and I keep wrapping. That locks it on with 3 or 4 wraps, and then I can just trim that away. Now for the feather, if this was a little bit smaller, I would use hackle pliers, But this is a good sized feather. I will have pliers here handy just in case if I need them. But I'm going to wrap the opposite way. So the chenille went over the top. This palmered hackle is going to go underneath and around this way. And you're going to palmer this on with open wraps. There's 4 wraps, and on the 5th wrap I'm going to bring it around, and just like the chenille, bring it on the outside of your bobbin. So when you pick up your bobbin, and I'm letting the thread glide along the jig head, so it's capturing any of those fibers on the outside of those fibers and pushing those back. And here's my tip, just like with Dad. The tip is the same length as the rest of the tips, but I'm going to cut that off. I'm just going to capture this so I can put a little tension on it. And just use my X-Acto knife to trim that away. So now I'll just stroke back the fibers, and again I'm going to just add 3 or 4, 5 wraps, letting that thread just glide along the outside of that jig head. So I'm angling it in this direction just so the thread keeps contact with the jig head and doesn't trap any of these fibers. And to finish this off, you can whip finish by hand, you can use a whip finish tool. I will just take a loop of thread of an opposite color, put it underneath my last wrap, and just with 3 wraps is all you need. 1, 2, 3. Keep tension on the thread between your hand and the collar. Even if I switch hands, there's always tension. Put your tag in through the loop and pull it through. To finish this off, we're going to use just a touch of lacquer-based head cement, which is thinned down just slightly, just a tiny bit, just so it saturates those threads. So I pulled a few of the books out of my collection that I discussed last time. I didn't want to mess up the titles and butcher the authors' names again. So the first one I mentioned was How to Fish with Jigs, and this was by Lacey Gee and Erwin Sy. It's a neat book. This is one of the older ones that I still find very useful and entertaining to look through. It was published around 1970. It looks like it was done with a typewriter and I don't know what was before copy machines. Really interesting sections in here. Some of the techniques and the way we look at jigs is still pertinent to today. And some of the information I think is forgotten. But this has a really nice pattern for jig fly, very similar to the jig we did in the last video. Another book that I really like, and we're only showing 3 today, but there's a handful of different books that are very popular and do have value. And if you're into jig tying, they're just fun to read. The next one is Angler's Guide to Jigs and Jigging, How to Make and Use the World's Deadliest Lures. This is by Ken Oberek. So in this book, you'll find description and flying instructions for what they are calling the Wolley Worm, which is very much the pattern that we just tied. In the last book I mentioned Very popular. There's all sorts of edits, or editions rather, for this book, going all the way back. The book I have was first copywritten in 1941, and I have a couple other versions of this book that might be a little bit newer, ones that I don't mind flipping through. I have one that's paperback. So that one, when I found it, it was slightly beat up. So I don't mind propping it open on my desk and holding the pages open with a couple weights if I'm trying to look at something. But the Professional Fly Tying, Spinning, and Tackle Making Manual and Manufacturer's Guide, which is the authentic fly tying dictionary of popular patterns and complete outline of fishing entomology, fresh and saltwater lure making. This copy is the revised 19th edition, and it's written and illustrated by George Leonard Herder. There's a ton of great information in the Herder's books, talking about everything from processing furs and feathers, fly tying, tying streamers, making spoons, making spinners, tying jigs. All sorts of great information in these. So the Herder's books have a lot of great information in them. I have a hard time getting through some of it. The way George Herder writes is very authoritarian, very braggadocious. Is that a word? And it's a writing style that you see in a lot of fishing books. Particularly, I've noticed it in a lot of the early fly tying booklets and manuals, and they almost write it like their writing is almost like they're sending somebody just a personal letter. So it's filled with lots of opinion and conjecture, and you kind of have to weed through that just to look at the facts and find the good information and kind of take away, or at least ignore for the most part. In this case, George Leonard Herder's point of view. So here's our jig, and we will hold up our sample. And other than these heads being different sizes, this is the 5/8, and the one we tied is a 1/2. Very nice jig. And I'll fish with these, most certainly. I'll fish with this jig. Two very nice jigs. One from Dad and one from us today. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, please put them in the comment section down below. I read all the comments and I try to respond to all of them as best I can. Also, be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new content. And I guess that'll do it for us tonight, guys. Until next time, keep tying and tight lines.